Mother-in-law's revenge. The dark plan of a scorned woman. Criminal story. Maria always prided herself on being a dedicated wife and mother. She had built her life around her family, and she believed that, in the grand scheme of things, that was what truly mattered. The world outside her home seemed chaotic, filled with uncertainty and turmoil, but within the walls of her house, everything felt safe. There, she and her husband, Carlos, had carved out a life that appeared to be as perfect as could be, one of quiet suburban contentment, where everything was in its place. Before we can continue, if you love crime stories, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. It wasn't just that they lived in a comfortable home in a peaceful neighborhood. It was the kind of home that people envied. The small, well-kept house was nestled on a tree-lined street, with flower beds in bloom in the front yard. Maria spent hours tending to the garden, proud of how it looked when the flowers bloomed, when the sun was just right. She had an idealized picture in her mind of what family life should look like, and she worked hard to maintain it. The inside of the house mirrored this sense of care, with cozy rooms decorated in soft, warm colors, each piece of furniture carefully chosen for comfort and function. Her husband, Carlos, was everything she could have asked for in a partner. He was kind, hardworking, and seemingly understanding of her role as both a wife and mother. They had 2 children, Luca, a bright 7-year-old with a passion for dinosaurs, and Maria's youngest, Beatrice, who was 3 and already showing signs of being an artist, always with crayons in hand, doodling on anything she could find. The family was tight-knit, and though they didn't have a lavish lifestyle, they had enough. Enough to be comfortable, enough to feel content. Maria had always believed that contentment was enough. But of course, there were challenges. Any woman with children would tell you that motherhood was a constant balancing act. For Maria, the challenge was not just raising children while managing a home and keeping a marriage intact. It was her relationship with her mother-in-law, Teresa, that often left her feeling off balance. It wasn't that Teresa was outright cruel, at least not in the overt sense, but there was an undercurrent of control that Maria could never quite shake. Teresa had always been a woman with strong opinions, particularly about family matters. She had raised Carlos, and in her eyes, that gave her an unparalleled understanding of what was best for her son, and, by extension, for his family. Maria had learned early on that the best way to deal with Teresa's subtle criticisms was to nod along, smile, and quietly go about her business. But over time, the constant presence of her mother-in-law in their lives started to feel like an encroachment. It wasn't that Maria disliked Teresa. She genuinely tried to build a relationship with her. Teresa would often come over for family dinners, and while Maria worked to create the perfect meal, Teresa would silently watch from the corner of the kitchen, occasionally offering advice or pointing out how something could have been improved. "You know, Maria, I always add a pinch of salt to the sauce. That's how I did it for Carlos, and he always loved it," she would say, her voice dripping with that kind of quiet authority that left little room for disagreement. Maria had learned to keep her comments to herself. What was the point in arguing over small things when the overall picture seemed good? Teresa's involvement in their lives was, for the most part, harmless. At least, that was how it seemed. She was a presence that loomed, occasionally vexing, but never threatening. After all, she was family, and that meant Maria had to tolerate her, right? But things changed the day Teresa visited to talk about something important, something that would start to unravel the carefully woven fabric of Maria's life. It all began one chilly autumn afternoon, just after Maria had put Beatrice down for a nap and Luca was in his room, absorbed in his toy dinosaurs. Teresa arrived unexpectedly at the house, her face drawn with an expression that Maria could only describe as disapproving. She sat down in the living room, adjusting her coat and glancing around as though the space did not quite meet her expectations. "Maria," Teresa began, her voice tinged with a familiar note of condescension, "I've been thinking about how things are going in this house. You know, I've been watching you with the children, and I think there are some things you need to consider." Maria was immediately on edge. She had learned long ago that any conversation with Teresa could quickly veer into uncomfortable territory, and she braced herself for the inevitable criticism. She sat down across from Teresa, offering a warm smile, though the smile felt more like a mask she wore to protect herself from the inevitable. "What do you mean?" Maria asked carefully, not sure what to expect. Teresa gave a slight shrug, a gesture that suggested that she was offering her advice out of the goodness of her heart, even though it was clear she expected Maria to listen and take her words to heart. "It's just that I've been thinking about the way you handle things with the children. It's not enough to let them run around like that. They need discipline. They need structure. Carlos and I never allowed that kind of behavior. You need to set clear rules for Luca and Beatrice. They're growing up, and the world won't be kind to them if they don't learn how to behave properly." Maria felt a flash of irritation, though she masked it quickly. "They're just kids, Teresa. They're playing and being themselves. There's no harm in it." Teresa pursed her lips, as though this response only confirmed her suspicions. "It's not about harm. It's about preparing them for the real world. Your approach is too relaxed. You're too lenient. Look at Carlos, he turned out well, but it wasn't because I let him do whatever he wanted. It's because I taught him the right way to behave." The words stung more than Maria cared to admit. They stung because Teresa wasn't wrong in some ways. Maria had always prided herself on being the laid-back mother, allowing her children to explore, to make mistakes, to learn naturally. But deep down, she had her insecurities. She feared that her easygoing approach might not be enough. But this conversation was different. Teresa wasn't just offering advice, she was questioning Maria's worth as a mother. She was insinuating that Maria wasn't good enough for her son, for her family. "I understand your point," Maria said, trying to keep her voice steady. "But I'm doing the best I can. I'm trying to raise them to be kind, thoughtful individuals, not just obedient ones." Teresa's eyes narrowed. "Being kind is fine, but kindness without discipline is weakness. And I'm not sure you're doing enough to prepare them for the world. You're too soft, Maria. A mother needs to be firm. Otherwise, you'll regret it later." Maria felt the weight of those words settle heavily on her chest. Her mind began to race, and for the first time in years, a seed of doubt was planted. What if Teresa was right? What if her approach was wrong? She had always tried to focus on nurturing her children's individuality, but could that approach lead them to failure? As the days passed after that conversation, Maria couldn't shake the unease that had settled in her heart. She loved her children deeply, and the thought of failing them weighed heavily on her. Teresa's words lingered in her mind, and with each passing day, Maria found herself doubting her own instincts. Was she truly a good mother? Was she doing enough? It wasn't long before the first signs of something more disturbing began to appear. It started with small things. Maria found herself feeling fatigued more often than usual. She would wake up in the morning, but instead of feeling refreshed, she felt a dull ache deep in her bones, as though her energy had been drained overnight. She dismissed it at first as stress, a natural byproduct of being a mother of 2 young children. But as the days wore on, her energy levels continued to plummet, and the fatigue deepened. Then there was the nausea. At first, it was just a mild discomfort after meals. But soon it turned into full-blown sickness. Maria began to dread the moments when it was time to eat. Even the smell of food would send her stomach into violent spasms. She found herself losing weight, feeling weak, as if something inside her body was slowly shutting down. Maria couldn't explain it. It didn't make sense. She went to the doctor, who ran several tests, but everything seemed normal. No infection, no underlying health conditions. The doctor suggested it was likely stress or even depression. "You have a lot on your plate, Maria," the doctor said, reassuring her. "This could be a result of anxiety or simply burnout from all the responsibilities you carry." But that explanation didn't feel right. Something deeper was at play. And despite all the signs pointing to stress, Maria's instincts kept whispering that there was more going on. Something far darker, something she wasn't seeing yet. Little did Maria know, the danger was closer than she could ever imagine. It wasn't her stress that was draining her. It wasn't her workload or the pressure of motherhood. It was Teresa. Slowly, methodically, Teresa had begun to poison her. One small dose at a time, Teresa was slowly taking away the life Maria had worked so hard to build. But for now, Maria was blind to it. She was too caught up in her own fears and doubts to see the true threat that had been lurking in her life all along. The days following Teresa's visit were some of the hardest Maria had experienced in a long time. She had always prided herself on being a strong, capable woman, someone who didn't easily let others' words affect her. But what Teresa had said struck a deeper chord than she would admit, even to herself. There was something about the way Teresa had questioned her mothering style, her approach to raising Luca and Beatrice, that Maria couldn't shake. It wasn't just that her mother-in-law had pointed out areas she could improve. It was the insinuation, the subtle but sharp suggestion that Maria might not be enough, that she might not be doing things the right way. The words echoed in Maria's mind every day. "You're too soft, Maria. A mother needs to be firm." At first, Maria tried to convince herself that Teresa's words didn't matter. She had been a loving and devoted mother to her children, had always provided a warm, supportive environment in which they could thrive. But as the days passed, something shifted. Teresa's words had planted a seed of doubt, one that began to grow in the fertile soil of Maria's anxieties. Could she be failing her children? Was she really the best mother she could be? The guilt gnawed at her. Even though she knew in her heart that she wasn't a bad mother, she simply had a different approach, one based on nurturing creativity, allowing her children to make mistakes, and encouraging independent thought. But now, for the first time, she began to wonder if this approach was enough. As if on cue, Maria's physical health started to decline. She'd been running on the adrenaline of motherhood for years, but now that energy seemed to have been drained from her, replaced by a constant feeling of exhaustion. It was more than just tiredness from running around after 2 small children. This was different, deeper. There were days when Maria could barely drag herself out of bed, when the thought of making breakfast or helping Luca with his homework felt like an insurmountable task. She didn't want to admit it to Carlos, didn't want to seem weak or incapable, but the toll was becoming too much to hide. Her appetite diminished, and when she did eat, she would feel an uncomfortable heaviness in her stomach, followed by nausea. She couldn't even keep a full meal down anymore. Even the smallest amounts of food made her stomach churn. But it wasn't just food that was bothering her. Her body was reacting to everything, as though she had become hypersensitive to the simplest of stimuli: bright lights, loud sounds, the texture of her clothes against her skin. It felt like something inside her was slowly shutting down, like she was slowly being drained of her vitality. Her doctors ran several tests, blood work, scans, and other routine examinations, but the results came back inconclusive. There was no clear explanation for her symptoms. The doctors suggested it might be stress, that the combination of motherhood, housework, and managing the demands of a busy family had simply taken a toll on her body. They told her to rest, to take it easy, to practice mindfulness and relaxation techniques. But Maria knew something was wrong. This wasn't just stress. She had dealt with stress before and had always managed to push through it. No, this felt different. Something was in the air, something invisible, something that was making her feel like a shell of herself. One evening, after yet another difficult day filled with nausea and exhaustion, Maria found herself sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the TV screen, too tired to even focus on the show. Carlos was in the kitchen, preparing dinner. As she absently watched the flickering images on the screen, her mind began to wander. And that's when it hit her, slowly at first, but unmistakably. What if someone was intentionally making her sick? The thought was absurd at first. Why would anyone want to harm her? She thought of her family, her friends. There were no signs of any real threat. No one had shown open hostility toward her. But then, her mind wandered back to the strange behavior of Teresa. Teresa had always been overbearing, always hovering in the background of her life. But now, Maria began to remember the little things, the subtle comments, the unnecessary critiques, the moments when Teresa had insisted on taking control of situations that Maria had tried to handle herself. Teresa always acted as though she knew best, as though Maria could never be trusted to make the right decisions. Maria's mind began to race. The more she thought about it, the more the pieces started to fall into place. The first time she'd felt unwell was right after one of Teresa's visits, where she had made a particular point to cook a special dinner for her. It hadn't been anything extravagant, just a simple chicken stew, but it was something Teresa had insisted on making herself. Maria had felt a slight dizziness after eating, but it had been so mild that she had shrugged it off. But now, in retrospect, Maria couldn't ignore the oddness of it. Teresa had always been a little too eager to help with the meals, especially when Maria was too tired to cook for herself. Teresa had even been known to offer Maria herbal teas and potions for relaxation, she'd said, whenever Maria felt stressed. At the time, Maria had always been grateful for the kindness, not thinking twice about what Teresa was handing her. It was then that a chilling thought crossed Maria's mind. What if Teresa wasn't helping her at all? What if, instead of being a concerned mother-in-law, she had been quietly sabotaging her health? The idea seemed so far-fetched, so implausible that Maria almost laughed at herself. But deep down, something told her to trust this intuition. She had learned over the years to listen to her instincts, and right now, her instincts were screaming that something was terribly wrong. Determined to uncover the truth, Maria began to pay closer attention to the food she ate, the drinks she consumed, and the moments when she felt sick. She started keeping a mental log, noting every meal she had and how it made her feel afterward. She carefully examined the teas and drinks that Teresa had made for her in the past, trying to recall any strange taste or odor that might have seemed off. But Teresa had always been so careful, too careful. There was never anything that stood out, nothing obvious to raise her suspicions. But the more she thought about it, the more Maria began to wonder. How had her condition escalated so quickly? She had always been in good health before, but now it seemed like her body was breaking down piece by piece. One afternoon, Maria decided to confront Teresa. She invited her over for tea, a move that felt both comforting and threatening at the same time. She knew that she couldn't accuse Teresa directly without any evidence, but she had to know the truth. She needed to see if Teresa was hiding something dark and dangerous. The moment Teresa walked into the house, Maria's heart began to race. She tried to maintain her composure, but inside, she was a whirlwind of emotion. She had to be careful. She had to be strategic. "Hello, Maria." Teresa greeted her with her usual wide smile, her voice sweet and warm. "I thought I'd come by and check on you today. How are you feeling? You look a little pale, my dear. You haven't been eating enough, have you?" Maria forced a smile and gestured for Teresa to sit down at the kitchen table. "I've been all right," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Just a bit tired, you know how it is." Teresa nodded sympathetically, but there was a glimmer of something in her eyes, a subtle, almost imperceptible flicker of something that Maria couldn't quite place. "I brought you some tea," Teresa said, setting a small thermos on the table. "I know you've been feeling poorly, so I made you something special. It will help you relax." Maria's stomach churned, but she smiled and nodded. "Thank you, Teresa. I appreciate it." As Teresa poured the tea, Maria's mind raced. She had to be careful. She couldn't make Teresa suspicious, but she had to know. She needed proof. Taking the cup, Maria brought it to her lips and sipped carefully. It was warm and fragrant, but there was something off. A faint metallic taste lingered at the back of her throat, something that Maria couldn't quite identify. It wasn't the taste of any herb she recognized. Her heart skipped a beat. Could it be? Her hands shook as she set the cup down. "Teresa," Maria said, her voice trembling slightly, "what exactly did you put in this tea?" Teresa looked at her with those calm, unreadable eyes, as though she hadn't heard anything unusual in Maria's question. "Oh, just a few herbs, my dear. Nothing harmful. Just a little something to help you feel better." Maria stared at her mother-in-law, the pieces finally falling into place. It was Teresa. She was the one making her sick. But the question remained, why? Why was Teresa doing this? What did she want from Maria? Maria was no longer in doubt. She was convinced. But she also knew that the fight to stop Teresa was only just beginning. Maria could no longer ignore the growing suspicion that had gnawed at her since that moment with Teresa. The metallic taste in the tea, the strange symptoms that had escalated over the past few months, and the unsettling feeling that had slowly crept into her life. It all pointed to one terrifying possibility. Teresa had been poisoning her. The thought was unbearable, yet the more Maria examined her situation, the clearer it became. Teresa, the woman who had always hovered just on the periphery of Maria's life, had turned into a predator, slowly but deliberately turning Maria's world upside down. The realization hit Maria like a freight train, and for the first time in a long time, she felt utterly vulnerable.
How could she have been so blind?
How could she have allowed herself to be manipulated, to be slowly torn down by someone she trusted? Teresa had always been controlling, but Maria had dismissed her interference as just the behavior of an overbearing mother-in-law.
Now,
Maria was faced with a truth she wasn't sure she was ready to confront. Her own mother-in-law had turned into a silent, calculating enemy. At first, Maria wanted to confront Teresa directly, to accuse her of poisoning her, to finally demand answers. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized how dangerous that approach could be. Teresa was shrewd. She wouldn't admit to anything, and if Maria confronted her without any solid proof, it could backfire in ways she wasn't prepared for. Teresa would only deny everything, spin a web of lies, and Maria would be left isolated, looking paranoid and unhinged. The idea of confronting her mother-in-law head-on was terrifying. Maria wasn't sure if she could win such a battle, especially one where Teresa's manipulation skills were so finely honed. Instead of diving into an open confrontation, Maria decided to adopt a different strategy. She would begin to investigate, to gather information, and to quietly observe. She would enter an unfamiliar, dangerous territory, a world of subterfuge and deceit, and try to outmaneuver Teresa at her own game. The first step in Maria's plan was simple yet crucial. She had to understand how Teresa was poisoning her, what the substance was, how it was being administered, and most importantly, whether there was a way to stop it. Maria had already begun to feel more cautious around the food and drinks Teresa offered her, but she needed more than just suspicion. She needed evidence, something tangible that she could use to expose the truth. With this in mind, Maria began to scrutinize everything she ate and drank. Every meal, every cup of tea, every treat that Teresa brought to her home became an object of suspicion. She carefully examined everything before consuming it. No more mindlessly accepting gifts of food and drink. If Teresa wanted to continue to poison her, she would have to be more careful, because Maria was paying attention now. But that was only part of her strategy. Maria knew that she couldn't fight this battle alone. She needed allies, people who could help her uncover the truth and, if necessary, stand by her when the time came to expose Teresa. The first person she turned to was her husband, Carlos. It had taken a lot of courage for Maria to even bring up the idea to him. She didn't want to seem paranoid or irrational, but the situation was becoming increasingly dire. She needed him to understand the gravity of what was happening. One evening, after putting the children to bed, Maria finally broached the subject. Her heart raced in her chest, and she could hear the tremor in her voice as she spoke. She couldn't quite get the words out without a certain amount of hesitation, but after a few false starts, she finally said it. "Carlos," she said, her voice tight, "I think Teresa is poisoning me." Carlos looked at her in stunned silence, his face a mix of confusion and disbelief. For a moment, he didn't speak, and the silence between them felt heavy, suffocating. "Poisoning you?" Carlos echoed slowly. "What are you talking about, Maria?" Maria took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "I don't have any proof yet, but I've been getting sick. My health has been deteriorating, and the doctors can't find anything wrong with me. But I know something is off. I've been feeling worse after Teresa's visits. After the meals she prepares, I feel nauseous, weak, and drained. It's happened too many times now for it to be a coincidence. I think she's doing something to me, Carlos." Carlos's expression shifted. He seemed torn between disbelief and concern, but it was the concern that stood out the most. "Maria," he said gently, "I don't want to dismiss how you're feeling. I know things have been tough for you lately, but Poisoning? That's a serious accusation. Are you sure? I mean, you've had some health problems before, and stress can do strange things to the body. Maybe it's just that. Maybe you're overthinking it. Maria felt a pang of frustration at his reaction, but she knew he wasn't deliberately dismissing her. He loved her, and he wanted to protect her. But he wasn't seeing what she saw, wasn't feeling the creeping dread that had settled into her bones. Still, she knew she had to make him see the gravity of the situation. "I'm not imagining this, Carlos," she said, her voice more insistent. "This is real. I feel it in my body, and I know I can't keep ignoring it. I need you to help me figure this out. I need to know what's happening before it's too late." Carlos took a long, slow breath, looking deeply into Maria's eyes. After a long moment of silence, he finally nodded. "All right," he said quietly. "We'll look into this together. We'll figure it out." Maria felt a surge of relief, but at the same time, an uncomfortable knot of fear twisted in her stomach. She wasn't sure how this would all unfold, but she knew she couldn't back down. She couldn't let Teresa win. With Carlos's reluctant but crucial support, Maria's investigation began to take shape. The first step was to gather evidence. If Teresa was poisoning her, there had to be some trace of it in her system. Maria decided to go back to her doctor and request more specific tests for toxins or poisons that might be lingering in her bloodstream. The doctors had already told her that there was nothing physically wrong with her, but now Maria was asking for something more targeted. She needed to rule out poisoning before she could confront Teresa, and she needed to do it discreetly. Over the next few days, Maria underwent several rounds of testing, each one more detailed than the last. The waiting was agonizing, but as the results came back, Maria's suspicions only grew. The tests revealed small traces of an unknown substance in her bloodstream, something that wasn't easily detected by standard procedures. The doctors couldn't pinpoint it immediately, but Maria knew that she had what she needed. She had proof, but it wasn't enough. Maria knew that if she was going to expose Teresa, she would need more than just traces in her blood. She needed something concrete, something that would stand up in a court of law or in a confrontation with her mother-in-law. As she delved deeper into her investigation, Maria began to take more drastic steps. She started keeping track of Teresa's visits, noting the exact times when she brought food or drink into the house. She began to carefully inspect everything Teresa gave her, testing it for any irregularities, any signs of tampering. Each time Teresa came over, Maria would act as if nothing was wrong, accepting the food and drink without protest, but all the while, she was collecting evidence. One day, after Teresa had left, Maria took a sample of the herbal tea Teresa had left behind. She took it to a local lab, requesting that it be analyzed for any harmful substances. The process was slow and painstaking, but after several long days of waiting, the results finally came back. The tea contained traces of a toxic substance, one commonly used in small doses to gradually cause illness. Maria's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the lab report. She had her answer. Teresa was poisoning her. With this new evidence in hand, Maria knew she was entering a dangerous territory. She had gathered enough proof to confront Teresa, but how would she do it? How could she expose her without triggering a violent backlash? Maria was stepping into unknown territory, into a battle that would test her in ways she could never have imagined. But one thing was certain, she would no longer be a passive victim. She was done letting Teresa control her life. The time had come to take back control and put an end to the sinister game her mother-in-law had been playing. Maria had entered an unfamiliar, terrifying situation, but now she was ready to fight. The journey would be long, and the stakes high, but there was no turning back. As Maria moved further into the labyrinth of her investigation, the unfamiliar world of subterfuge and distrust began to feel like a second skin. The weight of the secret she was carrying pressed down on her daily life, but she could no longer turn back. Every moment of normalcy now felt tainted, every interaction with Teresa laden with suspicion. The initial shock and fear had given way to a quiet determination, a resolve to see this through, no matter what it cost her. But as Maria adapted to this new reality, she realized how much it would require of her. how much she would need to change if she was going to navigate the murky waters of deceit without sinking herself. Maria had always prided herself on her ability to trust the people closest to her husband, her family, her friends. But now, in her pursuit of truth, she was learning to operate without that trust. Her suspicions about Teresa had cast a shadow over every relationship, and now even the simplest act of offering a smile or accepting a cup of tea felt like a calculated risk. Every gesture had to be considered, every word chosen carefully, for fear of revealing too much. She couldn't afford to let her guard down, not even with Carlos, who had, so far, been her one source of support. But even in his willingness to help her, Maria saw the danger of becoming too dependent on him. Her battle was one she had to fight herself. She couldn't rely on anyone else to win it for her. The first few days after her confirmation of the poisoning felt like a blur. Maria had an almost mechanical approach to everything now. She performed her daily duties without thinking, moving through the motions of motherhood and housework as though she were an automaton. There was no room for emotional outbursts or uncertainty, not if she was to survive this. She had already made up her mind to confront Teresa, to gather the strength to end this once and for all, but that decision wasn't as simple as it had seemed. In the midst of all this, Carlos became increasingly concerned about Maria's health. While he had agreed to help her investigate Teresa, he didn't fully grasp the extent of her mental and physical strain. His questions were gentle at first, but as Maria's exhaustion deepened, they became more urgent. He began to notice the dark circles under her eyes, the way she seemed to flinch when certain foods or drinks were presented to her, and the way her nervous energy made her appear on edge. He was no longer just worried about the symptoms she was experiencing. He was worried about what it was doing to her, about how the relentless pressure of her suspicion was eroding her sense of self. "Maria," he said one evening, as she sat across from him, pushing around the food on her plate. "I know you're trying to figure this out, but you're burning yourself out. You need to take a step back. Let me handle this. I'll talk to Teresa. I'll find out what's going on." Maria's eyes narrowed. The very thought of Carlos confronting Teresa sent a chill down her spine. She couldn't explain why, but she instinctively knew that Teresa would turn the situation around, twist Carlos's doubts into something that made her seem like the paranoid one. And that would be the end of it. Carlos's well-meaning interference would put a target on Maria's back, and Teresa, ever the manipulator, would exploit it. "No, Carlos," she said, her voice low but firm. "I have to do this myself. If I let you get involved, Teresa will only deny everything, and I'll be left with nothing. I need the proof, and I need to confront her on my terms." Carlos looked hurt, a flash of confusion and pain crossing his face. But Maria could see in his eyes that he was beginning to understand. This wasn't just about a physical illness, it was about control, about power, about survival. Teresa had already taken enough from her. She wasn't about to let her mother-in-law win, not now. The strain of the situation made it hard for Maria to keep up the act of normalcy. She had stopped confiding in her friends, stopped answering calls from her sister, and began withdrawing from everyone who could sense that something was wrong. She couldn't afford to explain herself or appear vulnerable. If she showed too much doubt or fear, the entire house of cards would come crashing down. Instead, Maria focused on her methodical investigation. She had already begun to collect small amounts of Teresa's food and drinks, storing them away for future testing. It was a quiet, careful process. She couldn't afford to be seen as suspicious, so she started taking subtle precautions, like subtly swapping out the drinks Teresa made for her with her own, taking a sip from the cup and immediately pouring the rest down the sink when Teresa wasn't looking. She wasn't sure how long she could keep this up, but the thought of ingesting another dose of whatever it was Teresa had been putting in her food was enough to push her into action. But Maria's attempts to adapt to her new life of constant vigilance came with consequences. Her sleep patterns were disrupted, and though she forced herself to wake up early every morning to care for Luca and Beatriz, her energy reserves were rapidly depleting. She had begun to suffer from insomnia, waking up in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, heart racing as she wrestled with nightmares of Teresa's betrayal. She would lie in bed for hours, unable to calm her mind, unable to stop the images of her mother-in-law lurking in the shadows of her home. At the same time, the strain of playing a role she was no longer comfortable with started to take a toll on her relationships. Even though she had sworn to Carlos that she would handle things herself, the isolation of her secret world was beginning to weigh heavily on her. The subtle lies she told him about feeling fine, about pretending to eat meals that made her stomach turn, wore on her. The gulf between them grew wider, and Maria started to notice that Carlos was becoming more distant. He could sense that something was wrong, but Maria couldn't let him into her world of suspicion without endangering the mission. One evening, as the tension in the house mounted, Maria found herself facing an unexpected moment of clarity. The children were playing in the living room, and she was in the kitchen preparing dinner when she heard Teresa's familiar voice at the door. It was a visit she hadn't anticipated, but the circumstances had been too volatile to avoid her mother-in-law forever. Maria braced herself, her body tense with a quiet fear. She couldn't afford to show any sign of what she knew. "Maria, darling." Teresa's voice carried through the house like a siren song, sweet and warm, but Maria could hear the underlying note of something darker. "I brought over some fresh bread from the bakery. I thought you might like a little treat tonight." Maria swallowed her anxiety and put on her best smile as she opened the door. Teresa stepped inside with her usual exuberance, her hands laden with packages of bread and pastries. Maria's heart raced, but she masked her emotions as she invited Teresa into the kitchen. The two women spoke briefly about trivial things, about the weather, the children's school activities, about how Maria had been feeling. But Maria couldn't escape the nagging voice in her head that warned her to be cautious, to stay sharp. She couldn't let Teresa slip through her defenses. Teresa set the bread down on the counter and began to prepare a cup of tea, the very same tea that Maria had become so wary of. Maria watched every movement closely, every gesture, every detail, as Teresa hummed quietly to herself. She had already planned to test the tea again, but now the sight of Teresa preparing it felt different. The moment stretched on longer than it should have, and Maria felt a rising sense of urgency. She couldn't let Teresa get away with this anymore. With a sense of sudden clarity, Maria knew what she had to do. She wasn't just a passive victim anymore. She had to take control, to make her own decisions without fear of what Teresa might do. This confrontation wasn't just about surviving the poison, it was about confronting the bigger issue of power, of control. Teresa had tried to dominate her life for too long, and Maria couldn't keep being silent. As Teresa handed her the cup of tea, Maria held it in her hand and met her mother-in-law's gaze. She took a slow sip, the hot liquid burning her tongue, but she didn't care. She was ready. "Thank you for the tea, Teresa," Maria said, her voice steady despite the chaos inside her. "But there's something I need to talk to you about." Teresa paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. For a moment, Maria could have sworn she saw a flicker of concern, something like fear, pass through Teresa's expression. But it was gone before Maria could fully grasp it. "You've been poisoning me," Maria said, the words coming out sharper than she had expected. It wasn't just a statement. It was an accusation. The silence between them stretched, thick and suffocating. Maria knew that her world was about to change. Maria stood there, staring at Teresa in the tense silence that followed her accusation. The words hung in the air like a threat, heavy and undeniable. Her heart pounded in her chest, a rush of adrenaline coursing through her veins. She had finally said it, the truth that had been eating away at her for months, the truth that she had been too terrified to speak until now. Teresa had been poisoning her. Teresa, for her part, didn't react the way Maria had expected. There was no outburst of anger, no immediate denial, and certainly no confession. Instead, her mother-in-law simply stared at her, an inscrutable expression on her face. For a long moment, it seemed like Teresa wasn't going to say anything at all. Maria's pulse quickened, the silence growing unbearable. Finally, Teresa spoke, her voice calm and measured. "Maria, what on earth are you talking about?" she asked, her tone almost amused. She didn't sound shocked or frightened, Rather, it was as if Maria had just made some absurd accusation that she didn't take seriously. Maria's stomach churned with a sickening mix of frustration and fear. She couldn't understand it. How could Teresa act like nothing was wrong, like she hadn't been systematically poisoning her over the course of months? The evidence was undeniable, and yet, here Teresa was pretending as though Maria was simply being paranoid. "You know exactly what I mean, Teresa," Maria shot back, her voice rising. "I've found the poison in my food, in my tea. I've had tests done. I have proof. I know what you've been doing to me." Teresa's expression didn't change. She didn't flinch, didn't even look surprised. Instead, she gave a small, condescending smile, as if she were humoring a child who had said something silly. "Maria, you really need to stop this," she said with an air of feigned concern. "I don't know what's going on with you, but you're clearly sick. Maybe you're imagining things, or perhaps you've been overworking yourself. I'm just here to help, as I always have been." The dismissal was worse than Maria could have imagined. Teresa wasn't acknowledging the truth, wasn't even trying to defend herself. She was simply undermining Maria's reality, twisting the situation so that Maria seemed like the one in the wrong. It was as if the years of manipulation had taught Teresa how to play this game to perfection, how to make Maria question her own sanity. Maria's hands trembled as she clutched the cup of tea, feeling a knot tighten in her chest. She had come here for a confrontation, to end the madness once and for all, but now it felt as though Teresa was going to gaslight her into doubting everything she had uncovered. The power dynamic was shifting before her eyes, and she was losing control. "You don't get to play the victim here, Teresa," Maria said, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and desperation. "I'm not imagining this. You've been wanting me, and I'm done pretending that everything's fine." For the briefest moment, a flicker of something crossed Teresa's face. Was it fear? A slight shift in her eyes, a tightening of her lips, but it disappeared just as quickly as it had appeared. Maria knew she had caught a glimpse of the truth, but Teresa was quick to recover. "Maria, I don't know what you're trying to do here, but this isn't going to help," Teresa said, her voice soft but firm. "You're clearly upset. You need rest, maybe a little therapy. But don't make accusations you can't prove." Maria felt the sting of those words like a slap. Teresa was trying to dismiss her again, trying to paint her as the unstable one. But Maria had the evidence. She wasn't imagining this. She wasn't crazy. She had fought too hard to back down now. "I do have proof," Maria insisted. "I have the lab reports. I have the tests. This isn't just in my head, Teresa. This is real. And I'm not going to let you get away with it." For the first time, Teresa's calm demeanor seemed to crack, ever so slightly. Her eyes narrowed, and there was a flicker of anger, but it was controlled, like a coiled spring ready to snap. "You think you can threaten me?" she said, her voice low and dangerous. "You think you can come into my house, accuse me of something so vile, and get away with it? You have no idea what you're dealing with, Maria." Maria's heart skipped a beat. There was something in Teresa's tone, a quiet menace that sent a shiver down her spine. For the first time in this confrontation, Maria felt truly afraid. Teresa's words weren't just threats, they were warnings. Teresa wasn't a person who backed down easily, and Maria realized, with a sickening clarity, that she was stepping into a much darker situation than she had anticipated. "Teresa," Maria said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I know what you've done, and I'm not going to stop until I expose you. I have the evidence. You can't keep hiding behind your lies." Teresa stood still for a moment, her eyes locked onto Maria's, as if sizing her up, calculating her next move. Then, slowly, a smile crept across her face, cool, collected, and utterly confident. It was the smile of someone who had just won, even though the battle wasn't over yet. "You really think this is about evidence, don't you?" Teresa asked, her voice soft and mocking. "You're so naive, Maria. Evidence won't protect you. It won't save you from the truth." Before Maria could respond, Teresa moved closer, her eyes glinting with a cold, calculating light. You've made a huge mistake. If you think you can take me down with a few test results, you're sadly mistaken. You'll regret this, I promise you." Maria's mind raced, but she forced herself to stay calm, to not let Teresa see her fear. She was ready for this confrontation. She had prepared for it. But something about Teresa's confidence was unsettling. She couldn't afford to underestimate her, not now. For a few tense moments, neither of them spoke. The air between them crackled with an unspoken understanding. Maria's body was rigid, every muscle on high alert. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing for sure. Teresa wasn't going to let this go quietly. "I don't think you understand, Maria," Teresa said, her voice calm but tinged with a darker edge. "You've won nothing. You may have found a few test results, but I'll make sure they mean nothing. I'll make sure you're the one who ends up looking like the crazy one." Maria's stomach twisted as Teresa's words sank in. She had been so focused on exposing the truth, on proving her suspicions, that she hadn't fully prepared herself for the battle that lay ahead. Teresa had always been cunning, always been a step ahead, and now Maria realized that she was in a fight for more than just her life. She was in a fight for her very sanity. "I'm not afraid of you, Teresa," Maria said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. "I've already won. You've been exposed. It's over." Teresa's smile widened, but it wasn't a smile of defeat. It was the smile of someone who had just begun to play her next move. "We'll see about that," she replied coldly. "We'll see how long you can keep up this little charade." As Maria watched Teresa walk out the door, a sense of dread settled in the pit of her stomach. The confrontation hadn't gone the way she'd imagined. It hadn't been the victory she had hoped for. Instead of feeling empowered, Maria felt more alone than ever. Teresa hadn't cracked. She hadn't confessed. In fact, it seemed as though she had just begun to escalate the situation, to play a deeper game that Maria wasn't yet prepared for. Maria had gotten what she wanted. She had exposed the truth, confronted Teresa, but in the process, she had also underestimated how far Teresa was willing to go. The victory that Maria had envisioned was nothing more than a fleeting illusion, a false sense of triumph. The real battle was just beginning, and Maria realized with growing horror that she might not be ready for what was coming next. In the days that followed, Maria began to see the full scope of what she had set in motion. Teresa's threat lingered in her mind, a dark cloud that hovered over every decision she made. Maria had been so certain of her righteousness, so sure that exposing Teresa would be enough to end the poison, but the stakes were higher now. The real war was only just starting, and Maria couldn't afford to lose. She had gotten what she wanted, a confrontation, a confession, a moment of vindication. But the victory she had sought was false. Teresa was still in control, still manipulating the situation. The game wasn't over, and Maria knew she would have to be smarter, stronger, and more ruthless if she wanted to come out on top. The battle for her life, and for her sanity, was far from won. In the days following her confrontation with Teresa, Maria had hoped that the worst was behind her. She had faced her adversary, made the accusation, and even felt a brief surge of satisfaction when Teresa had been forced to reveal something in the way she had responded, or rather, in the way she hadn't, that made Maria believe she had the upper hand. It was a fleeting moment of triumph, a burst of adrenaline that made her believe that the walls of deception were finally crumbling. But Maria's false sense of victory soon gave way to a terrifying realization. It wasn't just the fear that Teresa had threatened her with, though that was significant. It was the weight of something deeper, something darker, that Maria hadn't fully grasped until now. The truth that had driven her to this point wasn't just about the poison. It was about control, manipulation, and the suffocating grip that Teresa had over her. Teresa had always been a silent, unseen force in the background of Maria's life, pulling strings, sowing discord, and shaping events in ways that Maria hadn't even fully understood. Now, standing in the aftermath of her confrontation, Maria realized that she had fallen into a trap that Teresa had carefully laid out for her. Teresa wasn't just a poisoner. She was a master manipulator, and Maria had underestimated her at every turn. The first blow came quietly, almost imperceptibly, when Carlos began to pull away from her. It wasn't overt, not at first. He still loved her, still tried to comfort her during the long nights of insomnia, still tried to make their family life as normal as possible. But something was off. He had grown distant, emotionally unavailable in ways Maria couldn't explain. His concern for her seemed to shift from genuine worry to a subtle impatience. The warmth he had once shown her now felt like a mask, and she began to wonder if he was starting to believe the lies Teresa had planted in his mind. There was a subtle shift in the way Carlos spoke to her, the way he looked at her when she spoke about the poison, the way he hesitated before offering his support. It wasn't that he didn't care. Maria could still see traces of his love for her in the small things. The way he held her when she cried, the way he still made sure the kids were fed, and how he would sometimes kiss her on the cheek. But that love was fraying, unraveling at the edges. It was as if the very thing that had once held them together, their trust in each other, had begun to erode, piece by piece. "Maria, I just don't understand," Carlos said one evening, his voice laced with concern and growing frustration. "Why won't you let me help? I want to be there for you. You're pushing me away, and I don't know how to fix it." Maria, standing in the kitchen as he spoke, felt the coldness of his words cut deeper than any poison Teresa had put in her tea. It wasn't just the fact that Carlos didn't believe her. She had expected that, to some extent. It was the quiet sadness in his eyes, the sense that he was beginning to doubt her sanity. Teresa had already sowed the seeds of suspicion in his mind, and now Maria felt the painful weight of his doubt pressing down on her. "I'm not pushing you away," she said, her voice faltering. "But you don't understand. You're not seeing what I see. Teresa, she's been poisoning me, Carlos. I have proof. I'm not crazy. You have to believe me." But Carlos only shook his head. "I do believe you," he said, but the hesitation in his voice was enough to make Maria feel the full sting of his disbelief. "But you're so fixated on this. Maybe you're reading too much into things. I don't know what to think anymore. Maybe it's time we just let this go." And there it was, the moment that shattered her. Teresa had succeeded in what she had set out to do. It wasn't just about the poison. It wasn't even about the accusations. It was about tearing Maria apart, piece by piece, until she was nothing more than a paranoid, unstable woman in her husband's eyes. Carlos wasn't just being manipulated by Teresa. He had become part of the plan, unwittingly or not. That night, Maria lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling utterly alone. She had sought the truth, confronted Teresa, and even found the evidence to back her claims. But at what cost? The truth hadn't set her free. It had isolated her. It had made her a target. It had driven a wedge between her and the person she loved most. And now, with Carlos's growing distance, she began to see that the victory she had won was a hollow one, a prize that came with consequences she hadn't been prepared for. The next blow was more direct, more personal. It came from the last person Maria had expected, Beatriz. Her sweet, sensitive daughter, who had always been so close to her, began to act strangely, almost like she was keeping something from Maria. It was subtle at first, a brief moment when Beatriz hesitated before answering a question, a strange shift in her behavior when Teresa came around. Maria noticed that her daughter seemed uncomfortable around her mother-in-law, even more so than before. At first, Maria thought it was just the stress of everything that was going on, the tension in the house, the arguments, the worry over her own health. But soon, Maria began to see a troubling pattern. One afternoon, when Maria was sitting in the living room, she overheard Beatriz on the phone with someone. She couldn't make out all the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was secretive, hushed, almost fearful. Maria's heart sank as she heard Beatriz say, "I don't think Mama will ever get better. She's always so upset, and Papa's getting mad at her. Teresa says Mama just needs to rest. I don't think it's just the tea anymore." The words hit Maria like a slap in the face. Teresa had begun to manipulate Beatriz, too. The very daughter Maria had tried so hard to protect was now caught in the web of deceit. Maria had never imagined that Teresa would go so far as to involve the children, but now it was clear. Teresa had made her way into every corner of Maria's life. She had poisoned not just the food, but the hearts and minds of everyone Maria loved. That night, after Beatriz had gone to bed, Maria confronted her daughter. The conversation was heartbreaking. Beatriz admitted that Teresa had told her things that made her worried about her mother's behavior, things that made her think Maria was the one who was sick, who was imagining things. Teresa had painted Maria as the problem, the unstable one. And though Beatriz had tried to defend her mother, the seed of doubt had already been planted in her young mind. Teresa had turned Beatriz into an unwilling accomplice in her scheme, using her love for Maria to her advantage. "You have to stop this, Mama," Beatriz whispered through her tears.
Please.
"Teresa says you'll be better if you just rest, but you keep getting worse. Papa is upset with you. I don't want you to go away." The pain in Beatriz's voice was more than Maria could bear. Her heart broke for her daughter and for herself. She had lost so much already, her husband's trust, her own health, and now, even her child's faith in her. The price of the truth, of exposing Teresa's poison, had been too high. Maria's once unwavering belief in her cause began to falter. How had things gone so wrong? How had her pursuit of justice turned into a nightmare that threatened to destroy her family? In trying to reveal the truth, she had alienated the people who mattered most. She had sought retribution against Teresa, but now she realized that Teresa's manipulation wasn't just about the poison, it was about dismantling everything Maria had worked for. Teresa had succeeded in making Maria question herself, in making her family question her. And what had Maria gained in return? A hollow victory that had cost her more than she could bear. The final blow came when Maria received an unexpected visitor at the door. It was a police officer, his face grim, his expression filled with a kind of reluctant sympathy. He had come to inform Maria that the evidence she had collected, the lab tests, the samples, had been tampered with. The poison she had found in her system wasn't the same substance that Teresa had been using. There was something else at play, something that made it seem as though someone had set Maria up. The officer didn't say it outright, but Maria could tell that the investigation was going nowhere fast. Teresa had covered her tracks too well. The evidence Maria thought she had, the proof that had once seemed so irrefutable, had been compromised. Maria stood in the doorway, her hands shaking, the weight of the news sinking in. She had lost everything. Teresa had won. That night, Maria sat alone in the dark, her thoughts swirling with despair. She had chased the truth, had fought tooth and nail to expose the poison, but in the end, the price had been too high. Teresa had dismantled her life piece by piece, and Maria had nothing left but the bitter taste of defeat. Her victory had been false, her life shattered, and all Maria could do now was wonder how much longer she could hold onto the fragments of herself that remained. Maria had always believed that the truth would set her free, but now, after everything she had been through, she wasn't so sure. The idea that exposing the darkness hidden within her family would restore balance and order had been her guiding light for so long, but the reality had proved far more complex, far more brutal. Her life, once simple and filled with the warm bonds of love and family, had been shattered by the very people she had trusted the most. Teresa, once a shadow in the background, had revealed herself to be a master manipulator, a force Maria had never truly understood until it was too late. The poison, both literal and metaphorical, had crept into every corner of her existence, and now Maria was left to pick up the pieces of a life that no longer seemed recognizable. She had lost so much: Carlos's trust, the warmth of her family, her own sense of self. The evidence she had uncovered, the tests and lab results that once seemed like undeniable proof of Teresa's guilt, had turned out to be nothing but a mirage. The law had failed her. Teresa had outsmarted the system, and Maria, in her desperation to expose the truth, had exposed her own vulnerabilities instead. Now, she was facing the consequences of that misguided pursuit. Consequences that were more than just personal. They were irreversible. Yet, in the depths of this despair, something else had begun to emerge in Maria. Something she hadn't expected. As she sat alone in her bedroom, Contemplating the wreckage of her life, she realized that the woman she had been, desperate to hold onto her family, to keep everything intact, to fight for her innocence, was gone. The woman who now stood in the ruins was someone different. Someone hardened by the betrayal of her loved ones. Someone who had learned just how far people would go to maintain control, to protect their own interests. Maria wasn't the same woman who had blindly trusted, who had believed that truth alone would right the wrongs. No, now she was something else entirely, a survivor. Days passed, each one blending into the next, but Maria's mind never stopped turning. She couldn't erase the images of Beatrice's face, her daughter's eyes filled with confusion and fear, or the way Carlos's love seemed to slip further from her grasp. But as the days wore on, Maria began to see things more clearly. She had to face the truth, not just the truth of what had happened, but the truth about herself. She had been a pawn in Teresa's game, yes, but she had also been complicit in her own downfall. She had ignored the signs, dismissed her instincts, and believed that the truth would always find a way to be heard. Now, she knew better. The first step was to accept that the war with Teresa wasn't over. Maria couldn't simply retreat into silence, hoping everything would fall into place. Teresa was still out there, still a looming presence in her life, and she would stop at nothing to maintain control. But now, Maria was no longer the frightened, fragile woman she had been. She was wiser, more cautious. She had learned that the world wasn't fair, that justice wasn't always served, and that sometimes survival meant playing by different rules. Maria began to make plans. She started with small steps, reconnecting with old friends who had once been a part of her life before the chaos, reaching out to a therapist to help her process the emotional wreckage, and even finding time to enjoy moments with her children. She began to rebuild the life that had been shattered, but in a way that no longer relied on the comfort of denial or the hope that everything would return to the way it once was. Maria understood now that healing wouldn't come from putting everything back in its place, but from learning to move forward, one step at a time, even if the road ahead was uncertain. Her relationship with Carlos, though strained, still held the possibility of repair. There were moments when Maria could see a flicker of the man she had fallen in love with, the man who had once been her partner in life. But those moments were rare. Maria knew that she could never go back to the way things were. Teresa had already planted too many seeds of doubt in Carlos's mind, and Maria could feel the distance between them growing each day. She no longer expected him to fix things or to validate her pain. She had learned that some things, some wounds, couldn't be healed by anyone but herself. But she also knew that the truth she had uncovered, no matter how much it had torn her apart, had given her the strength to start over. And in that strength, there was a kind of freedom. One of the hardest realizations Maria had to face was the growing divide between herself and her children. Beatrice, in particular, had been the hardest to reach. Her daughter, so full of promise and innocence, had become a silent victim of Teresa's manipulation. Maria knew that the road to reclaiming her daughter's trust would be long and painful. Beatrice had seen things she couldn't unsee, heard things that had confused her, and now she was unsure of who to believe, unsure of her own place in this fractured world. Maria had to be patient, had to show her daughter, through her actions and her unwavering love, that she was still the mother Beatrice had once known. It would take time, but Maria was prepared to fight for her relationship with her children, to prove to them that they hadn't lost the essence of who they were as a family. But there were moments when Maria wondered if the damage was already too great. She had never truly understood the extent of Teresa's influence over her family until it was too late. Teresa's ability to manipulate and control was so insidious, so pervasive, that it had seeped into the very fabric of their lives. And though Maria had once believed that exposing Teresa's cruelty would be the key to unraveling her power, she now realized that the poison had spread too deeply for that alone to be enough. Teresa had made her presence felt in ways that Maria hadn't anticipated, ways that were far more subtle, far more damaging than the simple act of poisoning her food. It was the erosion of trust, the manipulation of feelings, the turning of family members against one another. It was a war fought not with knives or poisons, but with words, with lies, and with the slow, insidious destruction of relationships. Maria could no longer afford to rely on the hope that Teresa would be exposed or that justice would prevail in the way she had imagined. She understood that the battle was not about winning, not about bringing Teresa to justice or proving her right. It was about survival, about finding a way to live in a world where nothing was as it seemed and where even those closest to her could be turned against her. Maria no longer sought vengeance. She no longer needed to be validated by anyone. What she needed now was peace, a peace she could only find within herself. In the weeks that followed, Maria began to shift her focus inward. She started to work on herself, rebuilding the parts of her that had been torn apart by the manipulation, the fear, and the betrayal. She took up yoga, found solace in the stillness of the early mornings, and began to write in a journal, pouring out the thoughts she had kept hidden for so long. Writing became a kind of catharsis for Maria, a way to release the pain she had been holding onto for so long. It wasn't an immediate fix, but it was a step toward healing. Slowly, she began to find her footing again, not in the world she had lost, but in the world she could still control. But as the months passed, the specter of Teresa remained. It wasn't just the poison or the lies or even the broken relationships. It was the power Teresa still held, the control she had over everything that mattered to Maria. No matter how much Maria healed, no matter how many small victories she claimed for herself, Teresa's shadow lingered. It was a constant reminder that the world wasn't fair, that people didn't always get what they deserved, and that sometimes survival meant accepting the things you couldn't change. Maria's relationship with Carlos remained strained, but she no longer sought to force it back into its old shape. She knew that whatever had been between them, whatever trust they had once shared, was now lost. But she also knew that she had the strength to move on, to rebuild a life for herself, even if it meant leaving behind the dream of a perfect family. The bond between them had been broken, but Maria understood now that it wasn't the end of her story. She had learned that healing wasn't about going back. It was about moving forward, even when the road was unclear, even when the future seemed uncertain. And as for Teresa, Maria realized that she would never be able to escape her completely. Teresa's poison had seeped too deep into the family's dynamic, and the damage could never be undone. But Maria was no longer afraid of her. She had learned to live with the scars, to accept that some battles were not meant to be won, and that the greatest victory lay not in the destruction of her enemy, but in the reclamation of her own peace. Maria had returned to the familiar world she once knew, but she was no longer the same woman. She was stronger now, not because she had beaten Teresa, but because she had learned to survive despite her. She had discovered that the greatest truth was not in exposing the darkness around her, but in learning to live with it, and to find light in the places where it seemed impossible to exist. And in that quiet, unspoken understanding, Maria found her peace.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.